Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport bus at Fort Braxton, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her head held high despite the curious stares that followed her everywhere she went. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade ground, and she could already hear the whispered conversations beginning among the soldiers who had gathered to watch the new arrivals. She had grown accustomed to the stares over the past 3 years, the jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline, accompanied by the smaller networks of scarred tissue that decorated her neck and disappeared beneath her uniform collar, told a story that most people could only guess at. Some stared out of curiosity, others out of pity, and a few out of something that looked uncomfortably like revulsion. The scars were souvenirs from Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, where Sergeant Martinez had been serving as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. An improvised explosive device had changed her life in the span of 3 seconds, taking the lives of 2 of her squad mates and leaving her with injuries that the doctors had initially thought might be fatal. But Sarah Martinez was made of sterner stuff than most people realized. As she made her way toward the administration building to complete her in-processing, she noticed a group of soldiers lounging near the entrance. They were typical of what she had encountered at other bases, young, cocky, and apparently convinced that military service was some kind of extended fraternity experience rather than the serious business of defending their country. "Damn, check out Frankenstein," one of them muttered, not quite quietly enough to avoid being overheard. His companions snickered, and Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with this particular brand of ignorance. "Bet she was real pretty before whatever happened to her face," another one added, earning more laughter from the group. Sarah had heard worse, much worse, but it never stopped stinging. She had been pretty once, or at least she thought she had been. The photographs from before her deployment showed a young woman with smooth olive skin, bright dark eyes, and a smile that her mother always said could light up a room. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known in another lifetime. She pushed through the doors of the administration building, without acknowledging the comments, though she filed away the faces for future reference. In her experience, soldiers who made jokes about combat injuries usually had never seen real combat themselves, and they had a tendency to reveal their true character when things got difficult. The in-processing took the better part of 3 hours, during which Sarah completed paperwork, underwent a brief medical evaluation, and received her barracks assignment. She would be working in the base medical facility, continuing her work as a combat medic while also training newer soldiers in field medicine and trauma care. It was meaningful work, the kind that had drawn her to military service in the first place, and she was grateful to have the opportunity to continue serving despite her injuries. By the time she had settled into her barracks room and unpacked her belongings, the sun was setting and the evening chow call was echoing across the base. The dining facility was crowded and noisy, filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the clatter of metal trays and utensils. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the line, selecting a modest dinner while trying to ignore the continued stares and whispered comments from other soldiers. She found an empty table in a corner of the dining facility and sat down to eat in peace, but peace was apparently not on the menu that evening. The group of soldiers from earlier had spotted her and apparently decided to continue their entertainment at her expense. "Hey, Scarface," one of them called out as they approached her table. "Mind if we sit with you? We promise not to stare too much." Sarah looked up from her meal and studied the faces of the 5 soldiers who had surrounded her table. They were all young, probably not more than 22 or 23 years old, and they wore their uniforms with the kind of casual slovenliness that suggested they had never been deployed to a combat zone. Their name tapes identified them as Collins, Rodriguez, Thompson, Baker, and Williams, and their rank insignia showed them to be a mix of privates and specialists. "Actually, I do mind," Sarah said quietly, returning her attention to her food. "I prefer to eat in peace." "Come on, don't be antisocial," Collins continued, apparently the unofficial leader of the group. "We're just trying to be friendly. Besides, we're curious about your story. What happened to your face? IED? Mortar attack? Or maybe you just got on the wrong side of an angry Afghan?" The last comment drew snickers from his companions, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had dealt with this kind of ignorance before, but it never got easier. The assumption that her injuries were somehow her fault, or that they were fair game for jokes, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually entailed. Like I said, Sarah repeated, still not looking up from her tray, I prefer to eat in peace. Oh, come on. Rodriguez chimed in. Don't be like that. We're all soldiers here. We should stick together, right? Besides, chicks with scars can be kind of hot in a badass sort of way. That comment finally caused Sarah to look up, and the expression on her face was enough to make Rodriguez take a half step backward. There was something in her dark eyes that spoke of experiences these young soldiers couldn't begin to imagine. A hardness that came from seeing too much death and suffering at too young an age. You need to walk away, Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Right now, or what? Collins challenged, apparently too stupid or too proud to recognize the warning signs. You'll hurt us with your scary face? Before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. Is there a problem here? The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, a career soldier who had been watching the interaction from across the dining facility. Chen was a compact, muscular man in his early 30s, with the kind of bearing that immediately identified him as someone who had seen combat and earned his stripes the hard way. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his expression suggested that he had very little patience for the kind of behavior he was witnessing. No problem, Sergeant, Collins said quickly, suddenly remembering that he was supposed to show respect to his superiors. We were just talking to the new girl. The new girl has a rank and a name, Chen replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior soldiers stand up straighter. She's Sergeant Martinez, and unless she invited you to join her, you need to find somewhere else to sit. We were just being friendly, Thompson protested weakly. No, Chen corrected. You were being disrespectful, and if I hear about any more friendly behavior like this, you'll find yourselves on extra duty for the next month. Are we clear? The 5 young soldiers mumbled their acknowledgement and began to disperse, but Chen wasn't finished with them yet. Actually, before you go, he said, his voice stopping them in their tracks. I think you should know something about Sergeant Martinez here. She's not just some new arrival looking for friends. She's a Purple Heart recipient who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and she saved more lives in one deployment than most of you will in your entire careers. So the next time you feel like making jokes about her scars, remember that she got them while serving her country with more courage and dedication than you've ever shown. The dining facility had grown noticeably quieter during this exchange, with other soldiers stopping their conversations to listen. The 5 young soldiers looked appropriately chastened, and Collins actually had the grace to look ashamed of himself. Sorry, Sergeant, he mumbled in Sarah's direction before hurrying away with his companions. Chen watched them go, then turned to Sarah with an expression that was both respectful and sympathetic. I apologize for their behavior, he said. Most of the soldiers on this base are professionals, but every unit has a few knuckleheads who need to learn some manners. Thank you, Sarah replied, genuinely grateful for the intervention. But you didn't need to do that. I can handle myself. I'm sure you can, Chen agreed. But you shouldn't have to. We're supposed to be a team, and teams don't let their members get harassed over injuries they received in the line of duty. He paused for a moment, then added, I served in Afghanistan too. Second tour was in Kandahar province. I heard about what happened to your unit. That was some heroic work you did that day. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her throat. She didn't like talking about that day. Didn't like being reminded of what she had lost and what it had cost her. The official reports called her actions heroic, but she had never felt like a hero. She had simply done what needed to be done, what her training and her conscience had demanded. I was just doing my job, she said quietly. Maybe, Chen replied. But doing your job when everything is going to hell around you, when you're bleeding and your friends are dying, that takes something special. Don't let a bunch of kids who've never heard a shot fired in anger make you forget that. With that, he nodded respectfully and moved away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her dinner. The dining facility gradually returned to its normal volume level, but she noticed that the looks she was receiving now were different. Word had apparently spread quickly about her service record, and the curiosity and pity in people's eyes had been replaced by something that looked more like respect. She finished her meal in peace and returned to her barracks room, where she spent the evening reviewing the training materials for her new assignment. Tomorrow, she would begin working with a new unit, training young soldiers in the medical skills that might one day save their lives or the lives of their comrades. It was important work that gave meaning to her own suffering and sacrifice. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her sink. The scars were still there, still prominent, still telling their story to anyone who cared to look. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't look away immediately. Instead, she studied her reflection and tried to see herself as Staff Sergeant Chen had described her, not as a victim or an object of pity, but as a soldier who had served with honor and courage. The scars would always be with her, a permanent reminder of the worst day of her military career. But they were also a reminder of her strength, her resilience, and her commitment to serving something larger than herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably new encounters with ignorance and insensitivity. But she was ready for them. She had survived Kandahar province. She could survive Fort Braxton. Outside her window, the base was settling into its nighttime routine. Guard towers were manned, perimeters were secured, and another day of military service was drawing to a close. Somewhere in the darkness, young soldiers like Collins and his friends were probably learning their first real lessons about respect and professionalism. Lessons that would serve them well if they ever found themselves in harm's way. And in the morning, the real work would begin. The weeks that followed Sarah's arrival at Fort Braxton fell into a predictable routine. She reported to the medical training facility each morning at 0600 hours, where she worked with groups of newly arrived soldiers who were preparing for their first deployments. The work was challenging and rewarding, requiring her to translate her hard-earned battlefield experience into lessons that might save lives in real combat situations. Her students were a mixed group, ranging from eager 18-year-olds fresh out of basic training to older soldiers who had decided to cross-train into medical specialties. Most of them were respectful and attentive, genuinely interested in learning the skills that could make the difference between life and death in a combat zone. But there were always a few who seemed more interested in staring at her scars than listening to her instruction. Collins and his group had mostly kept their distance since the incident in the dining facility, though Sarah occasionally caught them watching her from across the base. They seemed to be waiting for something, though she couldn't quite figure out what. The base grapevine had apparently spread word about her service record, and most soldiers now treated her with the respect due to a combat veteran, but she could sense that not everyone was convinced. The tension came to a head during a particularly challenging training exercise in the third week of her assignment. Sarah had designed a realistic combat scenario in which the students would need to treat multiple casualties under simulated enemy fire, complete with smoke, noise, and the kind of chaos that characterized real battlefield conditions. The exercise was taking place in a specially constructed training area that mimicked an Afghan village, complete with mud brick buildings, narrow alleyways, and hidden obstacles. 20 soldiers were participating, divided into 4 5-person teams that would rotate through different scenarios throughout the day. Sarah was explaining the first scenario when she noticed Collins and his friends among the participants. They had apparently been assigned to the training rotation, and they were watching her with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. She made a mental note to keep an eye on them, but continued with her instruction. "The scenario is straightforward," she explained, standing before the group with her medical kit at her feet. "Your squad has been conducting a routine patrol when an IED detonated near the lead vehicle. You have multiple casualties with varying degrees of injury, and enemy forces are still active in the area. Your job is to provide medical care while maintaining security and preparing for evacuation." She gestured toward the mock village behind her, where several mannequins had been positioned to represent wounded soldiers. Red paint and theatrical blood had been used to simulate various types of injuries, from minor shrapnel wounds to traumatic amputations. "The clock starts when you enter the village," Sarah continued. "You'll have 15 minutes to treat all casualties and prepare them for evacuation. Communications with base are intermittent. Enemy contact is possible, and some of your equipment may malfunction during the exercise. Questions?" A young private named Jackson raised her hand. "Sergeant, will you be observing from outside the exercise area?" "Negative," Sarah replied. "I'll be in the village with you, playing the role of a wounded squad leader. Part of your challenge will be determining how to use my experience and knowledge while also treating my injuries. This announcement drew some surprised looks from the students, but also nods of approval. It was one thing to talk about combat medical procedures in a classroom, but quite another to demonstrate them under realistic conditions.
"What kind of injuries will you be simulating?" asked another student. "Severe facial trauma and possible traumatic brain injury." Sarah answered matter-of-factly.
"I'll be conscious but disoriented, and I may not be able to communicate clearly. You'll need to make decisions about my care while also managing the other casualties."
Collins exchanged a glance with his friends, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her wary. There was a challenge there, a suggestion that he was looking forward to this exercise for reasons that had nothing to do with medical training.
The first team moved into position, and Sarah took her place among the mannequin casualties, applying theatrical makeup to simulate fresh injuries over her existing scars. The effect was disturbingly realistic, and she saw several students flinch when they first saw her.
The exercise began with the sound of a simulated explosion, followed by shouts and confusion as the students entered the village. Sarah immediately began playing her role, moaning in apparent pain and calling out incoherent instructions. The team leader, a competent corporal named Williams, quickly assessed the situation and began directing his soldiers to treat the various casualties. To their credit, the first team performed well. They established security, triaged the casualties appropriately, and began treatment procedures with reasonable efficiency. Williams made the decision to treat Sarah's simulated injuries first, recognizing that her experience would be valuable if she could be stabilized and made more coherent. "Sergeant, can you hear me?" Williams asked, kneeling beside her and checking her pulse. "What's your name and what day is it?" Sarah responded with the confused, rambling answers that she had prepared for the scenario, providing enough information to be helpful while also demonstrating the challenges of treating a head injury. Williams handled the situation professionally, treating her simulated wounds while also extracting tactical information that would help his team. The exercise continued for the full 15 minutes, with Sarah maintaining her role while also observing the students' performance. They made some mistakes, but overall their response was solid and showed genuine understanding of the principles she had been teaching. When the time was up, Sarah called an end to the exercise and gathered the team for a debrief. She praised their strengths, pointed out areas for improvement, and answered questions about the procedures they had used. The feedback session was productive and professional, exactly the kind of learning experience she had hoped to create. The second and third teams performed similarly well, with each group bringing their own strengths and weaknesses to the exercise. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed with the quality of the soldiers she was training. They took the work seriously and seemed to understand the life and death importance of what they were learning. Then came the fourth team led by Collins. From the moment they entered the village, something felt different. Collins and his friends moved with less urgency than the previous teams, and their communications were sloppy and unprofessional. When they discovered Sarah among the casualties, their approach was noticeably different from what she had experienced with the other teams. "Well, well," Collins muttered as he knelt beside her, just loudly enough for his team members to hear. "Look what we have here. Frankenstein's been in another explosion." Sarah maintained her role, continuing to moan and call out incoherent instructions, but she was now paying close attention to Collins's behavior. His medical procedures were technically correct, but his manner was careless and borderline disrespectful. "Hey, Rodriguez," Collins called to one of his team members. "Come, take a look at this. Think we can make her face any worse than it already is?" The comment drew uncomfortable laughter from some of the team members, but Sarah noticed that others looked genuinely disturbed by Collins' attitude. This was supposed to be a serious training exercise, not an opportunity for juvenile humor at a combat veteran's expense. Collins, one of the other team members, a mature soldier named Peterson, warned quietly, "Knock it off. This is supposed to be realistic training." "Oh, it's realistic, all right," Collins replied, continuing to work on Sarah's simulated injuries with unnecessary roughness. "This is exactly what happens to soldiers who can't stay out of the way of IEDs." The comment crossed a line that even his friends seemed to recognize. The laughter stopped, and several team members exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were beginning to realize that Collins's behavior was not just unprofessional, but potentially dangerous to unit cohesion and morale. Sarah continued to play her role, But she was now documenting every aspect of Collins's performance for the formal evaluation that would follow. His medical procedures were adequate, but his attitude and communication skills were completely unacceptable for a soldier who might one day be responsible for treating wounded comrades. "You know," Collins continued, apparently emboldened by what he mistook for acceptance from his teammates, "I bet she was asking for it. Probably couldn't follow orders properly and got her whole squad killed." This comment finally pushed Peterson beyond his tolerance level. "Collins, shut your mouth," he said sharply. "You're talking about a Purple Heart recipient who saved lives in Afghanistan. Show some respect." "Respect?" Collins scoffed. "For what? Getting her face blown off and then coming here to play teacher? Please. Any of us could do what she does." "Really?" Sarah said quietly, breaking character for the first time during the exercise. Collins looked down at her in surprise, apparently not expecting her to respond coherently. "Did you just say any of you could do what I do?" Sarah repeated, her voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Well, yeah," Collins said, trying to maintain his bravado despite the sudden change in atmosphere. "I mean, how hard can it be? Follow some medical procedures, tell war stories, try to look tough with your scars." Sarah sat up slowly, the theatrical blood still streaking her face, but her eyes now completely focused and alert. The other students had stopped what they were doing and were watching the interaction with growing tension. "Stand up," Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the kind of command authority that made Collins comply automatically. "You think this job is easy?" Sarah continued, getting to her feet and facing Collins directly. "You think anyone can do it?" "Sure," Collins replied, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Let's find out." She turned to address the entire group of students, her voice now carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of combat experience. "Change of plans," she announced. "We're going to run one more scenario. Collins here thinks he can do my job, so we're going to give him the chance to prove it." Collins looked uncertain now, apparently beginning to realize that his mouth might have written a check his abilities couldn't cash. "Collins will take the role of the combat medic instructor," Sarah continued. "The rest of you will be his students. I'll be observing and evaluating his performance." "Wait," Collins started to protest. "I don't think..." "You don't think what?" Sarah interrupted. "You just finished telling everyone how easy this job is. Now's your chance to demonstrate your expertise." The other students were watching with intense interest now, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Collins looked around at their faces and realized that backing down now would destroy what little credibility he had left. "Fine," he said, trying to sound confident. "What's the scenario?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Simple," she said. "Mass casualty event. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive device in a crowded marketplace. Multiple casualties with varying injuries, hostile crowd, limited medical supplies, and no immediate backup available. You have 20 minutes to treat 5 casualties and prepare them for evacuation while maintaining security and crowd control." Collins swallowed hard, beginning to understand the complexity of what he had gotten himself into. "Your casualties will include a suspected terrorist with a possible spinal injury who may be armed, 2 civilian children with severe trauma, an Afghan interpreter with multiple shrapnel wounds who speaks limited English, and a senior American officer with life-threatening injuries who outranks you and is giving conflicting orders while in shock." The scenario Sarah had described was based on real events she had experienced in Afghanistan, a nightmare combination of medical, tactical, and political challenges that had no easy solutions. "Questions?" Sarah asked. Collins looked around at his teammates, who were now watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. None of them offered to help. "No questions," he said weakly. "Outstanding," Sarah replied. "Let's see what you've got." The training village had been quickly transformed into Sarah's nightmarish scenario. Additional mannequins were positioned to represent the casualties Collins would need to treat, while other instructors and advanced students took on the roles of hostile crowd members, confused civilians, and the various wounded personnel. The complexity of the setup was immediately apparent to everyone present, and Collins was beginning to look genuinely nervous as the reality of his situation sank in. Sarah had positioned herself where she could observe every aspect of Collins' performance, while also coordinating the scenario through hand signals and radio communications with the other role players. She wanted this to be as realistic as possible, not to humiliate Collins, but to drive home the point that combat medicine was far more complex than following a checklist of procedures. "Ready?" Sarah called out. Collins nodded, though his face had gone pale beneath his uniform cap. The scenario began with the sound of a massive explosion, followed immediately by screams, shouts in multiple languages, and the chaos of simulated panic. Collins and his team were thrust into a maelstrom of confusion that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the real combat situations that Sarah remembered all too well. The first problem became apparent within seconds. Collins had no system for taking control of the situation. While his teammates milled around uncertainly, waiting for orders that didn't come, the role-playing civilians continued to scream and crowd around the casualties, making assessment and treatment nearly impossible. "Collins!" Peterson finally shouted over the noise. "We need to establish a perimeter and get these people back." Collins looked around frantically, apparently paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. In a real combat scenario, this kind of delay could have been fatal for the casualties and dangerous for the medical team. Right, Collins stammered. "Rodriguez, Thompson, set up security. Williams and Baker, start checking the casualties." But the orders were too vague and came too late. Rodriguez and Thompson had no clear instructions about where to position themselves or what to watch for, while Williams and Baker began examining casualties without any systematic approach to triage or prioritization. Sarah watched grimly as the scenario continued to deteriorate. Collins had moved to the first casualty, the simulated terrorist, but he was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The role player was doing an excellent job of portraying someone who might be armed and dangerous while also requiring immediate medical attention. "I don't know what to do with this one," Collins called out to his team, his voice rising with panic. "He might have a weapon, but he's bleeding pretty bad." "And search him for weapons first, then treat the bleeding," Peterson suggested, but Collins seemed frozen with indecision. Meanwhile, the two simulated child casualties were dying from their untreated wounds, their role players doing an excellent job of portraying the kind of heartbreaking injuries that Sarah had seen too many times in Afghanistan. Collins hadn't even assessed them yet, focusing instead on his uncertainty about the terrorist. The interpreter casualty was calling out for help in broken English mixed with Pashto, adding another layer of complexity that Collins was clearly not prepared to handle. And the simulated American officer was attempting to give orders while portraying the confusion and disorientation that came with serious head trauma. "Sergeant, I need you to call for immediate evacuation," the officer role player demanded, grabbing Collins' arm. "That's a direct order." "But sir, I'm supposed to treat the casualties first," Collins replied, his voice cracking with stress. "I don't care what you're supposed to do. I'm ordering you to call for evacuation now." Collins looked around desperately for guidance, but his teammates were struggling with their own aspects of the scenario. The hostile crowd members were becoming more aggressive, pushing closer to the casualties despite Rodriguez and Thompson's ineffective attempts to maintain a perimeter. 8 minutes into the 20-minute scenario, it was clear that Collins was completely overwhelmed. He had managed to apply basic bleeding control to one casualty, but he had no systematic approach to the situation and no leadership presence to coordinate his team's efforts. In a real combat situation, people would already be dying from preventable causes. Sarah stepped forward and called out, "Scenario pause." The noise and chaos stopped immediately as all the role players froze in position. Collins looked up at her with obvious relief, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool morning air. "What's your assessment of the situation?" Sarah asked quietly. Collins looked around at the scene, taking in the untreated casualties, his confused teammates, and the hostile crowd that was still pressing close to the medical area. I don't know," he admitted, his earlier bravado completely gone. "There's too much happening at once. I can't keep track of everything." "That's right," Sarah agreed. "There is too much happening at once. That's what real combat medicine looks like. It's not just following procedures from a manual. It's making life-and-death decisions under extreme stress while coordinating multiple team members and dealing with tactical, medical, and political complications simultaneously." She moved to stand beside the first casualty, the simulated terrorist. This casualty has a possible spinal injury, which means you need to be careful about how you move him. But he might also be armed, which means you need to secure him before treatment. And he might have information that could save American lives, which means you need to keep him alive even though he might have just tried to kill you. Collins nodded, beginning to understand the impossible complexity of the decisions he was being asked to make. Sarah moved to the child casualties. These two have priority injuries that will be fatal if not treated immediately. But they're also terrified and don't speak English, which means you need to communicate through actions and expressions while performing procedures that are going to cause them more pain. She gestured toward the interpreter. This man risked his life to help American forces, and now he's depending on you to save his life. But he can only communicate in broken English, and some of his injuries might not be immediately visible. Miss something, and you failed someone who trusted you with everything. Finally, she indicated the American officer. This is your superior, giving you direct orders that conflict with your medical training and your assessment of the tactical situation. Do you follow orders that might get people killed, or do you ignore the chain of command and risk court-martial? Collins looked around at all the casualties, his teammates, and the hostile crowd, finally beginning to grasp the true scope of what combat medics faced in real-world situations. "I don't know how to handle all of this," he said quietly. "Neither did I the first time," Sarah replied. "The difference is that I had to learn on the job, with real casualties and real consequences. Every mistake I made might have cost someone their life. Every decision I delayed meant someone was bleeding out while I tried to figure out what to do." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The day I got these scars," she continued, touching her face unconsciously, "I was dealing with a scenario very much like this one, vehicle-borne IED in a crowded area, multiple casualties, hostile crowd, and no backup immediately available. The only difference was that the blood was real, the screaming was real, and the consequences were permanent." Collins looked down at his feet, apparently ashamed of his earlier behavior. "How did you handle it?" he asked. "Badly at first," Sarah admitted. "I made mistakes, I lost people I should have saved, and I second-guessed myself constantly. But I learned from each mistake, and I never stopped trying to do better. That's what this job requires, the willingness to keep learning and improving, even when the stakes are life and death." She turned to address the entire group of students. "The reason we do realistic training exercises like this isn't to embarrass anyone or show off. It's because the skills you learn here might save your life, or the lives of your friends someday. When you're in a real combat situation, there won't be time to figure things out or practice procedures. You'll need to react automatically, based on training that's become second nature." Peterson raised his hand. "Sergeant, how do you develop that kind of automatic response? How do you learn to handle situations this complex?" "Practice," Sarah replied. "Lots and lots of practice with increasingly complex scenarios. You start with basic procedures and gradually add layers of complexity until you can handle multiple priorities simultaneously. And you learn from people who have been there before, who can teach you not just the procedures but the judgment calls that aren't in any manual." She looked directly at Collins. "The most important thing is recognizing that this job requires humility. The moment you think you know everything or that it's easy, you become dangerous to the people depending on you. Combat medicine is one of the most challenging specialties in the military because it combines medical expertise, tactical awareness, leadership skills, and the ability to make ethical decisions under extreme pressure." Collins nodded, his expression now serious and respectful. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology," he said. "I had no idea what you deal with, and I was completely out of line with my comments." "Apology accepted," Sarah replied. "But more importantly, I want you to understand that the purpose of this exercise wasn't to humiliate you. It was to show you what you need to prepare for if you want to be effective in this role." She gestured toward the training area. "Would you like to try the scenario again? This time, I'll coach you through the decision-making process so you can see how to break down a complex situation into manageable components." Collins looked surprised by the offer, but also grateful. "Yes, Sergeant, I'd like that very much." "Outstanding," Sarah said. "But first, let's reset the scenario and talk through the systematic approach to mass casualty situations. The key is having a framework that you can apply regardless of the specific circumstances. For the next hour, Sarah walked Collins and the other students through the mental processes that experienced combat medics used to handle complex medical scenarios. She showed them how to quickly assess and prioritize casualties, how to coordinate team members effectively, and how to balance medical priorities with tactical and political considerations. When they ran the scenario again, Collins performed significantly better. He still made mistakes, but he now had a systematic approach that prevented him from being overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. His teammates also performed better, responding to clear orders and working as a coordinated team rather than a collection of confused individuals. By the end of the exercise, Collins had successfully treated all 5 casualties and prepared them for evacuation while maintaining security and managing the hostile crowd. It wasn't perfect, but it was competent, and it demonstrated real understanding of the principles Sarah had been teaching. During the final debrief, Collins raised his hand again. "Sergeant, I want to apologize again, not just for today, but for my behavior since you arrived here. I realize now that I was judging you based on your appearance rather than your experience and expertise. That was wrong, and it was unprofessional." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "That kind of honesty and self-awareness is exactly what makes a good soldier. The willingness to admit mistakes and learn from them is more important than getting everything right the first time." She looked around at all the students. "The scars I carry aren't something I'm ashamed of. They're a reminder of the day I learned how much responsibility comes with this job, and how important it is to take that responsibility seriously. Every one of you will face situations that test your skills, your judgment, and your character. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. You will. The question is whether you'll learn from them and become better soldiers as a result." As the training day ended and the students began packing up their equipment, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere had changed completely from that morning. The looks she received now were filled with genuine respect and appreciation, not curiosity or pity. Collins and his friends approached her as she was loading her medical kit. "Sergeant," Collins said, "would it be possible to get some additional training with you? I realize I have a lot more to learn, and I'd like to be as prepared as possible before my deployment." Sarah looked at him for a moment, seeing in his face the kind of serious commitment that she respected in a soldier. "Report to the medical training facility at 05:30 tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll start with advanced trauma procedures and work our way up to complex scenario training. Fair warning, it's going to be challenging." "Yes, Sergeant," Collins replied, his voice carrying a new note of respect and determination. As Sarah walked back to her barracks that evening, she reflected on the day's events. The confrontation with Collins had been unpleasant, but it had also served an important purpose. The other soldiers on base now had a better understanding of what combat medicine involved, and hopefully a greater appreciation for the sacrifices made by wounded veterans. More importantly, she had potentially saved lives by ensuring that Collins and his teammates understood the true complexity and responsibility of their chosen specialty. The lessons they had learned today might make the difference between success and failure when they faced real combat situations. The scars on her face would always mark her as different, would always draw stares and questions from people who had never experienced combat. But they also served as a visible reminder of the price of service and the courage required to continue serving despite the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new students to train. But tonight, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she had done her job well and that the soldiers under her instruction were better prepared for whatever they might face. The change in atmosphere around Fort Braxton was subtle but unmistakable. Word of the training incident with Collins had spread through the base with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve, but the story had evolved in the telling. What had begun as a simple confrontation between an instructor and a disrespectful student had become something larger, a demonstration of expertise, professionalism, and the kind of leadership that earned genuine respect. Sarah noticed the difference immediately. Soldiers who had previously avoided eye contact now nodded respectfully when she passed. The dining facility conversations no longer stopped abruptly when she entered, and she found herself being invited to join tables of soldiers who wanted to hear about her experiences and training methods. Collins had been true to his word, reporting for additional training every morning at 05:30. His attitude had undergone a complete transformation, and he approached the challenging scenarios Sarah designed with the kind of serious focus that she respected in a professional soldier. His improvement was remarkable. and she found herself genuinely impressed with his dedication to learning. 3 weeks after the training incident, Sarah was in her office reviewing lesson plans when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to Colonel Andrews, the base commander.
"Sergeant Martinez, I need you to report to my office immediately. There's someone here who wants to meet you."
Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. Unexpected summons to the commander's office were rarely good news, and she couldn't think of any reason why someone would specifically want to meet her. She quickly checked her uniform to ensure everything was in order, then made her way across the base to the administration building. The commander's office was located on the second floor of the main administration building, behind heavy oak doors that spoke of authority and tradition. Sarah knocked twice and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," Colonel Andrews called out. Sarah pushed open the door and stepped into the office, immediately coming to attention when she saw that Andrews was not alone. Standing beside his desk was a figure she recognized immediately from photographs and news coverage: General Patricia Morrison, a 3-star general who served as the commanding officer of the entire military district. General Morrison was a compact woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of bearing that came from decades of leadership in challenging assignments. She wore her uniform with the casual perfection that marked career officers who had earned their positions through competence rather than politics. "Sergeant Martinez reporting as ordered, sir," Sarah said, maintaining her position of attention. "At ease, Sergeant," Colonel Andrews replied. "I'd like you to meet General Morrison. She's here conducting an inspection of our training programs, and she specifically requested to meet with you." Sarah relaxed slightly but remained alert, wondering what had brought a general officer to seek her out personally. General Morrison stepped forward with a slight smile.
"Sergeant Martinez, I've been hearing interesting things about your training methods. Colonel Andrews tells me you've been making quite an impression on the soldiers here."
"I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Sarah replied carefully. "Yes, I've heard that before," General Morrison said with what might have been amusement. "In fact, I've heard it from you specifically. Do you remember Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sergeant?" October 15th, 2022. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Forward Operating Base Chapman was where she had been serving when her unit was hit by the IED that had changed her life. She remembered the date because it was burned into her memory along with everything else about that terrible day. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "I was Colonel Morrison then, commanding the brigade that included your unit. I was the one who approved your recommendation for the Purple Heart, and I was also the one who read the after-action reports describing what happened that day." General Morrison moved to stand directly in front of Sarah, studying her face with an expression that was both serious and sympathetic. "According to those reports, you treated 7 casualties under direct enemy fire, including performing emergency surgery on a collapsed lung using improvised equipment. You did this while suffering from your own serious injuries, including a concussion and facial trauma that should have rendered you combat ineffective." Sarah remained silent, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. She had never enjoyed talking about that day, and she especially didn't like being praised for what she considered simply doing her duty. "The reports also indicated that you refused evacuation until all other casualties had been treated and removed from the danger zone. Is that correct?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"And when you were finally evacuated, you continued to provide medical guidance to the helicopter crew during the flight to the field hospital, despite your injuries and the medication you were receiving for pain." Sarah nodded, though she barely remembered that part of the day. The period after the explosion was mostly a blur of pain, confusion, and an overwhelming determination to ensure that her wounded comrades received the care they needed. General Morrison stepped back slightly, her expression becoming more formal. "What I found most impressive about those reports, Sergeant, was not just your medical performance under fire, though that was exemplary. It was the fact that you maintained unit cohesion and leadership during one of the most chaotic and dangerous situations that any soldier can face. According to your squad leader, who unfortunately didn't survive the incident, you took command when he was incapacitated and coordinated the medical response while also directing defensive actions against continued enemy contact." Colonel Andrews was listening to this recitation with obvious surprise, apparently learning details about Sarah's service record that hadn't been in her standard personnel file. Sarah wished desperately that she was anywhere else at that moment. "The reason I'm telling you this," General Morrison continued, is because I want you to understand that your reputation extends far beyond this base. I've been following your career since that day, and I've been consistently impressed with your dedication to training and developing other soldiers. She paused, glancing toward Colonel Andrews before continuing. I'm here today because I've been tasked with identifying exceptional non-commissioned officers for a new program that's being developed at the Pentagon. It's called the Advanced Combat Medicine Leadership Course, and it's designed to train senior medics who can serve as advisors and instructors for special operations units. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Special operations assignments were highly competitive and extremely challenging, representing the pinnacle of military medical service. The program requires candidates who have demonstrated not just medical expertise, but leadership ability, training skills, and the kind of character that can't be taught in a classroom. Based on your service record and the reports I've been receiving about your work here, I believe you're exactly what we're looking for. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the office door. Colonel Andrews frowned, apparently not expecting any interruptions. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal Collins looking nervous but determined. He stepped into the office and immediately came to attention when he saw the general. "Private Collins reporting, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was told this was urgent." "What's so urgent that it couldn't wait?" Andrews asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Sir, there's been an incident at the training facility. We have multiple casualties from a helicopter accident, and Sergeant Martinez is being requested immediately to assist with medical response." Sarah felt her training kick in automatically, pushing aside the surprise and discomfort of the conversation with General Morrison. "How many casualties?" she asked, already moving toward the door. 7 confirmed, sir. Mix of crew and passengers. Some of them are pretty bad." Sarah was already thinking about medical priorities and resource requirements, her mind shifting into the focused mode that had served her well in combat situations. "General Morrison, Colonel Andrews, if you'll excuse me," she said, heading for the door. "Sergeant," General Morrison called after her. Sarah paused and turned back. "This conversation isn't finished. I'll be observing your response to this incident as part of my evaluation." Sarah nodded and hurried out of the office, following Collins toward the training facility. As they jogged across the base, Collins filled her in on the details of the accident. "Training helicopter went down during a routine flight," he explained, breathing heavily as they ran. "Mechanical failure, not enemy action. But some of the injuries are severe, and the base hospital is dealing with another emergency. They need experienced medics to stabilize casualties for transport." They reached the training facility to find a scene of controlled chaos. The helicopter had crashed in an open field adjacent to the training area, and emergency responders were already on scene working to extract casualties and establish a medical treatment area. Sarah quickly assessed the situation and moved to where the most seriously injured were being brought. The next 2 hours tested every skill she had developed during her years of service. The casualties ranged from minor injuries to life-threatening trauma, and the medical team was working with limited resources in challenging conditions. Sarah found herself naturally taking charge of the medical response, coordinating with other medics, making triage decisions, and providing hands-on treatment for the most critical cases. What impressed the observers, including General Morrison, who had arrived to watch, was not just Sarah's medical expertise, but her leadership presence. She remained calm under pressure, communicated clearly and effectively, and made difficult decisions with confidence. The younger medics looked to her for guidance, and she provided it without hesitation. During the response, Collins worked directly alongside her, demonstrating the improved skills and confidence he had developed through their additional training sessions. At one point, when they were working together to stabilize a casualty with multiple trauma, he looked up at her with obvious gratitude. "Sergeant, I can't thank you enough for the extra training you've been giving me. I never would have been able to handle this before." Sarah nodded briefly, her attention focused on the casualty they were treating, but she was pleased to see how much he had improved. The confrontational young soldier she had first encountered had been transformed into a competent and confident medic. When all the casualties had been stabilized and evacuated to appropriate medical facilities, Sarah finally had a moment to catch her breath. She was sitting on the tailgate of an ambulance, cleaning blood from her hands, when General Morrison approached. "Impressive work, Sergeant," the general said, settling down beside her. I watched the entire response and I saw exactly the kind of leadership and expertise that we need for the advanced program I mentioned. Sarah looked up at her, still processing the events of the day. You coordinated 7 medics, managed resources effectively, made critical triage decisions, and provided expert medical care, all while maintaining the kind of calm authority that kept everyone focused on their jobs. That's not something that can be taught, it's the result of experience, character, and natural leadership ability. General Morrison paused, watching as the last of the emergency vehicles departed the scene. I'm also impressed by what I heard about your work with Private Collins, turning a disrespectful and unmotivated soldier into someone who can perform effectively in a crisis situation. That's the kind of training and leadership impact we need in special operations environments. Sarah thought about Collins' transformation over the past few weeks, and the pride she had felt watching him work effectively during the emergency response. He's a good soldier, she said. He just needed someone to show him what the job really required. Exactly, General Morrison agreed. And that's what you'll be doing in the advanced program, training and mentoring medics who will be working in the most challenging and dangerous environments the military has to offer. She stood up and looked down at Sarah with an expression of serious respect. I'm formally offering you a position in the Advanced Combat Medicine Leadership course. It's a 2-year assignment that will include advanced medical training, leadership development, and the opportunity to work with the best soldiers the military has to offer. You'll be based at Fort Bragg, but you'll deploy regularly to provide training and support to special operations units around the world. Sarah considered the offer, thinking about the possibilities it represented. It was an honor to be selected for such a program, and it offered the chance to have a significant impact on military medical training. What would be my rank and position? She asked. You'd be promoted to Staff Sergeant immediately, with the expectation of further advancement as you progress through the program. Eventually, you'd be eligible for selection as a senior instructor or program administrator. The promotion alone was significant, but the opportunity to shape the training of elite medics was even more attractive. Sarah thought about all the soldiers she could potentially influence and the lives that might be saved as a result of better training and preparation. I'm honored by the offer, ma'am, she said. When do you need an answer? Take the time you need to think about it, General Morrison replied. But I hope you'll say yes. The military needs people like you in positions where they can have maximum impact. As General Morrison walked away, Sarah remained sitting on the ambulance tailgate, watching the sun set over the training facility. The events of the day had been unexpected and challenging, but they had also been deeply satisfying. She had been able to use her skills and experience to make a real difference, and she had seen the positive impact of her training efforts in Collins' performance. The scars on her face would always be with her, a permanent reminder of the cost of military service. But they had also become a symbol of something else: resilience, dedication, and the willingness to continue serving despite personal sacrifice. The soldiers around her no longer saw those scars as disfigurement or weakness. They saw them as evidence of experience, courage, and the credibility that came from having faced the worst and survived. As she finally stood up and began walking back to her barracks, Sarah realized that she had already made her decision about General Morrison's offer. The advanced program represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for. A chance to use her experience and expertise to train the next generation of combat medics and to ensure that they were as prepared as possible for whatever challenges they might face. The young woman who had stepped off the transport bus at Fort Braxton several weeks ago had been carrying scars and uncertainty about her future. The soldier walking across the parade ground tonight was carrying purpose, respect, and the knowledge that her service continued to have meaning and impact. Tomorrow she would give General Morrison her answer and begin preparing for the next phase of her career. But tonight, she was content to enjoy the satisfaction that came from a job well done and the recognition that her sacrifices had not been in vain. The scars would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, and that story was still being written.